Hi everyone, my name is James, and this is my extreme bench vise build. So if you saw part 1, welcome back. And if you didn't, you ought to go check it out. In part 1, this is where we left off. We had just finished building the static body and the dynamic body and jaw portion, and we're going to continue from there today. In this static body or fixed portion of the vise, I've got to have a slot in order to hold the nut. The nut is the thing that the threaded rod will go in and out of, and that's what allows the vise to clamp down. This slot needs to go all the way through the top and bottom of this static body for maximum strength. And that's where the nut will be held. And here's a quick preview of this assembly. Sometimes we get bored in the shop and we have to amuse ourselves, so hopefully you can understand that. Now I'm cutting the very bottom portion, which I'm going to affix to the static portion of the body. And this is what I'm going to put holes in to allow me to bolt it down to my tabletop. And I think a chamfer around this will look nice. Holes in the corners will allow me to bolt this down to the bench top. I'm just doing a little bit of a countersink here to get rid of the sharp splintery edges. Of course, it takes enormous amounts of glue to glue these two pieces together. And a couple of more blocks of this beautiful Indian rosewood to go in the midpoint of the jaws that will be attached to the static body. If you are jointing short pieces, make sure you are familiar with your tool's requirements, your jointer's requirements as to what the minimum length is that you can joint. And always follow those rules to be safe. Lots and lots of glue and even more clamps. That's the way I bond everything together. In my opinion, if you have room left where you could fit a clamp, then you simply haven't put enough clamps. Okay, now it's time to joint and square this block up a little bit. Now, I have mentioned this before, but it does bear repeating. I am making this type of a cut on my table saw because I have more than 30 years of experience doing this. If you ever need to make a cut and you feel uncomfortable doing it, then don't. Find a way that is safer or makes you feel safer, or something that you're more comfortable with before using your table saw. Here's an example of what a properly adjusted table saw can do. My blade is exactly parallel to my miter slots within 1/1000th of an inch. My fence is exactly parallel to my miter slots, also within about 1/1000th of an inch. My blade is carbide, it's a high quality blade, and it's razor sharp. And as you can see, there's no problem making a cut that's paper thin. Even a 2-part cut comes out so smooth, it looks as if it had just one pass. So in this rosewood block that becomes part of the jaws of the static body, I need to put a dado. That way it's going to fit perfectly over this block of wood, which is holding the nut. That will give me extra strength when the jaws clamp together. With this type of a dado cut, I'm going to take many passes, a very shallow cut each time. This is especially important because the block is small and I'm hand holding it here. This type of cut would be a great candidate to be put on a dado sled, which is basically a crosscut sled for the table saw with a wider slot to cut dados. And there we have it. You can see how this is going to fit over that protruding block that held the nut. Now I have to trim it down to the proper height. And we can see that this is the height that will match the jaw on the other side. It's also important to note that I did put the end grain of the rosewood facing toward the clamping surface. I did that on both sides. And this will be the back side of the jaw, which has got the same taper as the front jaw. Here I'm cutting some PurpleHeart pieces that will be sandwiching that rosewood part in the center. These will also be part of the static jaw. And here you can see kind of how this is going to come together. And now the very outermost pieces of PurpleHeart to complete all of the components of the static jaw. Now it's time to glue this assembly together. I'm going to show you a new technique here to glue a whole bunch of pieces together at once and to keep them all square. I'm putting a piece of wax paper down on my tabletop, and I have clamped a board, a perfectly straight board, to the tabletop, and I'm going to kind of align everything to that. Lots and lots of glue, of course, as you would expect. So here what I'm doing is I'm going ahead and applying a very tight clamp to this for just a couple of seconds to squish it together. And then the glue has a property, once you've clamped it tight, it tends to want to bond. So I can take the clamp off in just a couple of seconds, and that piece isn't going to slide around. Then I can go ahead and glue the next piece, put it in place, clamp it again tightly, briefly, and just continue in a progression like that. Each time I do that, I'm making sure that it aligns perfectly to the front, and I'm going to end up with a structure that's nice and square and flat and straight. Once again, just a quick tight clamp, then I'll release it and put the next piece. Sometimes this can be a whole lot easier than applying glue to a bunch of surfaces at once and then trying to clamp everything down at once, because there's a lot of slipping and sliding. And I've cut these pieces pretty close to what I want their final dimensions to be, so I don't really want any movement to occur. In those instances is when I use this type of a clamping method. And of course it always helps to have extra people, and so my daughter is there helping me. If you see the band-aid on her arm there, that's actually from a burn from cooking in the kitchen. I almost didn't let her in the shop because I didn't want people to look at that and sit and think that perhaps she got injured from working out in the shop. I, of course, was unable to keep her from coming out into the shop, and so she's in the video. And there we have it. The structure is all done, and so now I will go ahead and clamp it all the way around very tightly. And if you look carefully, actually, you don't even have to look carefully. There's my daughter Sai, the photo bomber. So it's a good idea to take this component, which consists of a lot of pieces, and just give it a quick once-over on a large flat sanding block, just to make sure it's completely flat. And the sanding block also happens to make a good surface to sand the top of it with, because it won't slide around. And I've got to put some angles on this static jaw to match the profile of the jaw that's on the dynamic side. Here I'm going to show the construction of that block that holds the nut. I'm using some 6/4 walnut because I had some scrap left over from the end of a tabletop that I built. And it almost looks like one piece because it was glued and clamped so well. I'm just milling it down to the exact final dimensions to fit into our slot. With some careful measuring, the details of which are included in our plans, I know where to put the hole for the nut. Since the hole for the nut will need to be chiseled out to fit the nut exactly, it's a good idea to use a Forstner bit to bore the bulk of it out first. And this is a big one. It's a 3-inch diameter Forstner bit because the nut is so large. And I've used my combination square to set and measure my depth. After tracing around the nut to get the exact location, you see my daughter in the background there sneaking a look, we'll use the mallet and chisel to finish off the hole. A lot of people are nervous to do a job like this. Using a chisel to make a hole that's going to fit a nut perfectly, it's not hard. It's extraordinarily easy. If you have a reasonably sharp chisel, and any old hammer or mallet will do, you can do this. It doesn't have to be perfect, and it's exceedingly easy. So don't let something like this hold you back. I've got to make sure that it's flush there, and it is. And now it's time to bore a hole in the center. This will be a 2-inch diameter hole so that the threaded rod can go all the way through this. Any glue that bonds wood to metal will work fine here. You can use epoxy, you can use a polyurethane glue, or you can use a construction adhesive like this Loctite that I've used. Just make sure you let it cure fully before you move forward. And the reason for that is because the glue is not holding any of the clamping force. It's just holding the nut in place. The wood is preventing the nut from moving. And that's it. This wraps up this portion of the build. I'm going to let this cure, and I will be back in a day or so with the final video. I hope you come back and join us for the completion of the project.